Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Haints Podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Fear, at its very core, makes our stomach knot and our hearts race. For most, fear is an unpleasant, unwelcome emotion that we try to avoid having in our lives. Then why do so many of us have such a fascination with horror films? And not just the films, but all things horror related are and have always been very much in fashion. Today is podcasts like this one, and internet-based fiction like creepypasta. Before that, it was horror novels, and for previous generations, it was sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories. Fear has made authors like Stephen King and Clive Barker very wealthy, and before them, people flocked to the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker, who picked up where Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley left off, and a long line of authors and storytellers, going all the way back to Beowulf and Homer. For a lot of us, watching horror movies started off as taboo, sneaking around watching HBO when our parents were asleep. Sociologists tell us that those forbidden thrills last well into adulthood. Psychologists have identified several theories as to why we find these movies so intriguing, and some of them are quite far-fetched. One psychologist claims that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is representative of turn-of-the-century homosexual intolerance, and that the, quote, chocolate brown fog, unquote, referred to in the novel is a metaphor for anal sex. Another psychologist suggests that horror films simply reflect the societal fears of the era. They demonstrated this by looking at the history of horror, starting with the mutating monsters films of the 1950s, in a time when the public was fearful of nuclear attack and its aftermath. Okay, that makes sense. They went on to claim that the zombie films that emerged in the 60s were representative of our armed presence in Vietnam. And in the 80s, slasher films represented society's mistrust of authority figures stemming from the Watergate scandal. Okay. But don't worry. There are some logical arguments out there. Many psychologists believe that our childhood fears are still alive deep within our subconscious. They think that horror movies allow us the opportunity to experience fear in a safe environment. So, if the shit gets too real, we can just close our eyes or change the channel. Others argue that our love-hate relationship with fear goes much further back than our own childhood terrors. They say that we've evolved to find certain stimuli scary. For example, even very young children will respond quicker to images of snakes and spiders than they do to, say, a flower or a puppy. Psychologist Matthias Classen sees this as proof that there is such thing as human nature. One of the first signs of self-awareness for early humans would have been that they are mortal. They were definitely not the top of the food chain. They were all manner of beasties looking to make a meal of us. Even today, in certain parts of the world, animal attacks are still an everyday possibility. Snakes, spiders, big cats, alligators. Classen says that through the generations, these threats have left an indelible mark on our psyche. When we look at horror films, many of them play into this evolutionary theory. There are plenty of movies with creatures in them, but even the supernatural entities like vampires, werewolves, and zombies can trigger the same predator stimuli. Slasher films may not have a creature in them per se, but you still have something that is virtually unstoppable, stalking and hunting its victims. So it's not hard to see some parallels there. Of course, not all horror films fit this theory. but a large number of them do. And then there's something called the uncanny valley. This was originally a term used in the robotics industry. Robot designers have worked for decades to give robots more and more human-like features. But they found that the closer they got to their goal, the less the general public wanted to interact with their creations. They discovered that people tend to be creeped out by things that are almost, but not quite, human. The uncanny valley phenomena is thought to account for the fascination with zombie films, and also explain the popularity of movies like The Ring. In addition, the effect applies to inanimate horror villains such as Chucky and Annabelle. But most psychologists subscribe to the theory that there are three primary factors that make us want to watch horror films: detachment, relevance, and unrealism. Detachment is the theory that by watching these films, it allows us the opportunity to experience life-threatening situations from a position of relative safety. Some even claim that horror films may be a sort of training for these confrontational situations that we may face in our lives. That, despite the fantastical elements, horror films are usually very realistic in the way that they portray human psychology and relationships. That brings us to relevance. How much you enjoy certain horror movies can depend on how you empathize with the characters. Some viewers will empathize with the killer, and others with the victim. And how we empathize may change as our individual situations change. For example, a new mother may react more emotionally to movies with kids in them than someone without children. Sociologist Margie Carr studied the brainwave activity of screaming. That's right, screaming. She wanted to demonstrate how horror movies allow us to empathize with the different characters by recreating their experience within ourselves. She found that, quote, the brain of someone screaming looks similar to someone who is just watching someone scream, or even someone who is thinking about someone screaming, end quote. Yet another factor is called unrealism. Very often the same people who love watching gory horror films will struggle to watch images of real-life graphic violence or footage of surgical procedures. The knowledge that what you are watching in those movies isn't real helps you deal with the brutal imagery portrayed on the screen. This is one reason why kids are more susceptible to having nightmares as a result of watching scary movies as opposed to an adult. Adults are generally more adept at separating fantasy from reality. Unrealism also explains why films based on events that could really happen affect us very strongly. Films like The Strangers and The Purge. So why can't we stop watching the chilling cinematic chaos? It seems that the answer is different for each of us. Why do you love watching horror films? All the experts seem to agree that, to varying degrees, we need these films. They help us, not only as individuals, but also as a society, to cope with the everyday horrors of real life. Or as author Warren Ellis puts it, quote, horror fiction is how we both study and defang our monsters. To lock violent fiction away, or to close our eyes to it, is to give our monsters and our fears undeserved power and richer hunting grounds. Since this is a show about all things dark and spooky in the Carolinas, I'd like to take a minute to talk about the horror films made here in the Carolinas. North Carolina used to be famous for its filmmaking, and at one point was the third busiest state for film production after California and New York. Wilmington is the home of Screen Gem Studios, a 50-acre, full-service studio lot with 10 stages and 150,000 square feet. Several notable horror films were famously made in Wilmington, including The Conjuring, The Crow, The Exorcist III, and currently the sequels Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends are being made back-to-back there. 2018's Halloween revival starring Jamie Lee Curtis was filmed in nearby Charleston. The teen slasher I Know What You Did Last Summer, written by North Carolina native Kevin Williamson, was also filmed in the coastal region. But Wilmington and the coast aren't the only areas famous for filmmaking. Winston-Salem is home of the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, School of Filmmaking, which has produced some of today's top filmmakers, including David Gordon Green, Jody Hill, Jeff Nichols, Travis Beecham, and Danny McBride. Horror films made in the Piedmont include Cabin Fever, Hellraiser 3, and my all-time favorite horror film made in my hometown of Wadesboro, North Carolina, Evil Dead 2. On several occasions, I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to visit the Evil Dead 2 cabin, or what's left of it, and was even able to feature it in my first film, Hank vs. the Undead, also a North Carolina-made horror film. My latest film, Uncle Otto's Truck, was partly filmed in Ararat, Virginia, and in the North Carolina towns of Danbury, Madison, Mount Airy, and Greensboro. Uncle Otto is an adaptation of a Stephen King short story, and North Carolina is certainly no stranger to Mr. King and his films. King himself directed his first and only feature film, Maximum Overdrive, in Wilmington in 1986. While it didn't have the lasting impact on the horror community the way that Evil Dead 2 did, multiple King adaptations have been filmed in the Carolinas since the mid-'80s, including Silver Bullet, Cat's Eye, The Rage Carrie 2, Firestarter, and Children of the Corn 2. A large portion of the film Hannibal, directed by Ridley Scott, was also filmed at the Biltmore Estate in Nashville. And if you're a horror fan in North Carolina, and you're interested in seeing some of the best horror independent film has to offer, then look no further than our very own Wreak Havoc Horror Film Festival. This is an annual event hosted by my company, Wreak Havoc Productions, and is an international showcase of highly curated horror shorts and feature films. We just concluded our 5th year in Greensboro, and we plan to come back for another year. Just visit WreakHavocHorrorFilmFest.com for more information. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. You can find everything he's up to at his company at adarkerworld.com. You can find everything that I'm up to at my company at WreakHavocProductions.com. You can find me on Instagram at Wreak Havoc Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. You can email me with your thoughts and concerns at WreakHavocProductions@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to this special Halloween episode of the Carolina Haints Podcast. We'll be back with another regular episode soon. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.